Good morning. Welcome to the book launch of Religious Hatred, Prejudice, Islamophobia, and Anti-Semitism in Global Context by Paul Hedges. This is organized by the Center for Interfaith Understanding. We are a recently set up organization, society since last year, and we've been involved in creating spaces for conversation and understanding and building bridges with people of different faiths, cultures, and traditions. And today, this is our special day on Easter Sunday, where we discuss about religious hatred, and we have a range of guest speakers and panelists who will be talking about it, including Paul Hedges. A little bit about the Center for Interfaith Understanding. We've been organizing the Global Interfaith Leadership Series, in which we've had global leaders and faith leaders from different traditions speak about how they look at religions and how they relate to religions, including Francis Xavier Clooney and Professor Paul Tantamanio. We've also been involved in workshops and that engage the youth, as well as developing spaces for International Women's Day for women to have a conversation. So now I'm going to hand over the mic to Imran, and we will begin this book launch.
It over to the moderator, but nonetheless, I would like to welcome everyone to the book launch. Thank you very much for those viewers who are on the Facebook page. Actually, it's a very special day because today is Easter Sunday. And one of the things that we need to be reminded is that Jesus was put on the cross, and as a result of that, there was a growth of anti-Semitism also, because for a period in time in history, the people were blaming the Jews. The Christians, especially in the West, was blaming the Jews for the crucifixion of Christ. And that has given rise to a lot of anti-Semitic sentiments. But today also we are facing with growing Islamophobia, as well as forms of hatred and prejudices against minorities everywhere in the world. So I think it's a very timely period for us to be discussing this. And we are very fortunate to have Professor Paul Hedges to guide us through later on why he's writing the book and what's the objective of the book, as well as what we can learn from our common history, where prejudice and hate has been part and parcel of the destructive forces of the world, and therefore we need to learn and move forward and how to make this world a better place for all of us. So right now I would like to pass the mic to our moderator, Nur Sheila Moiz, who is currently with Studies in Interreligious Relations in Plural Societies program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University. So without further ado, I invite Sheila to begin the proceeding of the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Imran, and thank you everyone for being with us on this Sunday morning. So let's get started straight away. We have Professor Yaacob Ibrahim, who's advisor of SIFU, and he will start with some introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Sheila, and a very good morning to all of you, and welcome to this program organized by SIFU. Let me begin by wishing all my Christian colleagues here and out there a happy Easter Sunday. And I'm really happy to be here on this very important occasion, not just to launch the book, but to really have a discussion about the book and the things that we can learn, especially for this topic of interest, which is spreading across the world, and how we as activists in this space can play a part to ensure that religious hatred do not continue to grow, and how we can manage it. We all know that prejudice and ignorance about beliefs and practices of the religious other often exacerbate conflicts, and religious stereotypes contribute to both misunderstanding, and they can foment animosity. And hatred of the others, especially the religious others, in fact undermine the ability and the potential of religion in peace-building efforts. And in fact, many have stepped forward in the name of peace, not religion, to promote religion as one of the many avenues available to mankind to bring peace on earth. So hence we have SIFU and other like-minded institutions dedicated to the idea of religion as a path to peaceful coexistence. But how do we do this? One antidote that has been suggested to deal with the hatred between religious communities is in fact to teach communities about the beliefs and the practices of the religious other. And as I mentioned by our chairperson, that we have had several programs undertaken by SIFU to bring in thinkers and practitioners of how interfaith can be further enhanced, not just by understanding, but to go deeper in terms of understanding each other's belief. So it is particularly important that when we teach about religions, this should also be introduced in our educational institutions, in our schools or universities, and in places where people learn to become religious practitioners, in our madrasas, in our seminaries, in our other religious institutions. Religious communities are in fact part of the human existence, and therefore we need to know them better. More importantly, we need to know them accurately. So it's important that in teaching about the other, this is something which I learned more recently, that instructors need to act as though they are in the presence of the other, and to teach the religion as seen from the perspective of the believer. I think that's important. But beyond scriptures and religious history and theology, our students should also be exposed to the rituals, the worship, the practices of the other faith. Interreligious dialogues must be pervasive across all sections of human society, from academics to grassroots levels and even to the levels of lived spiritualities. It is essential for us to recognize the similarities between the various faiths and also to appreciate the differences among the various faith communities. And among the young, for example, one of the things that practitioners have found to be very effective is to combine the learning about another religion with a shared service project that brings together adherents to both religions. So for example, it is common across all faiths, the need to help the poor and the needy. And this is something which informs all of our religious beliefs and how this can be used as a platform to bring people from different faiths together. So on that note, I welcome all of you to this discussion. I look forward to the discussion later on, especially the book launch, and thereafter the discussion to be led by the moderator. Thank you very much again and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Yaacob. So Professor Yaacob will be with us throughout, and you can ask him questions later. And before we start the launch and the comments from our author, we have with us here today Mr. Ben J. Benjamin from the Jewish Welfare Board Singapore, as well as Ms. Oki Madasari, who's a PhD candidate at National University of Singapore. So Mr. Ben, we'll start with you first on discussions on anti-Semitism in the global context and more specifically also in Singapore, based on your experiences.
Thank you very much. My name is Ben Benjamin. Thank you so much for having me today, Guat, Imran. It's a pleasure to be here. As is so often the case with interfaith work, what happens with one religion always happens with another. And in this case, it is Easter Sunday. It's also the last day of the Passover in the Jewish faith. It also happens to be a holy day for us. So happy celebration to everybody. I'm going to be speaking with regards to my experience of anti-Semitism, or very localized experience of anti-Semitism later in the panel. I believe there is a video clip from the Chief Rabbi of Singapore that will address all of us today on the topic of anti-Semitism, global anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia as well. Imran, are we putting that on?
Professor Yaacob Ibrahim, Professor Paul Hedges, my dear friend Imran, esteemed panelists, dear friends. First, I'd like to offer my sincere thanks to all the organizers for this meaningful and important event. Unfortunately, I could not attend in person because today marks the 7th day of the Jewish Biblical Festival of Passover, which is a day of great joy for us, but a full day of work for your humble servant. And so by divine providence, this event takes place in a time which is for Jews, time of collective celebration and redemption. I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate Professor Paul Hedges on the launch of his new book, Religious Hatred, Prejudice, Islamophobia, and Anti-Semitism in Global Context. The topic is timely and addresses one of the greatest challenges facing our world today. In truth, to speak of anti-Semitism in Singapore in the same sentence is a little of an oxymoron. I've lived here for 26 years. Not once have I been the subject of an attack, an anti-Semitic attack, which is actually quite amazing when you think of it. That is not the case, I have to say, in other places around the world. I was raised in Belgium, where anti-Semitism is a fact of everyday life, at least for people who look like me. And I feel very sorry about that. But I think it's fair to say that Southeast Asia and Singapore don't have a legacy of historic anti-Semitism. And that is maybe one of the reasons why Jews have felt so welcome here. That said, as we have seen recently, Singapore is not insulated or shielded from pernicious and destructive ideologies, and this is because our main medium of access to information today is through the internet. So how do we address the problem of anti-Semitism? Well, first we have to define what is anti-Semitism. Of course, I want to do this from a Jewish perspective, and to share here insights from great Jewish thinkers. Most prominent among them for me is the late Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory, who is the Chief Rabbi of the Commonwealth in the United Kingdom. And before I do this, I'd like to share maybe a small joke. It's about a Nazi that walks the streets of Berlin in the 1930s. He sees a Jew, he apprehends him, and he says to him, "Jew, what is the cause of all the world's greatest problems?" The Jew is paralyzed in fear, and he says, "The bicycle riders and the Jews." Nazi says, "Why the bicycle riders?" And the Jew to reply, "Why the Jews?" So what is anti-Semitism? What do anti-Semites believe? You will immediately see that the answer is a series of contradictions. Jews were hated in the 19th century because they were rich, because they were poor, because they were capitalists, because they were communists, because they kept to themselves, and because they infiltrated everywhere. Voltaire hated the Jews because of their superstitious faith. And Stalin hated the Jews because he saw them as ruthless cosmopolitans who believe in nothing. So anti-Semitism is a series of internal contradictions. And it could be understood only on the model of epidemiology. Anti-Semitism is a virus that infects the body politic. Now, the body has a most remarkable and sophisticated system for fighting and defeating, detecting viruses, and that is the immune system. And of course, the way viruses survive is by mutating. And anti-Semitism is a virus that has mutated over time. Over the past 2,000 years, it's mutated 3 times. And that, in fact, is really mind-boggling, because if you look at Europe, for instance, we're still within living memory of the Holocaust. Europe has invested 50 years of fighting racism, of Holocaust education, heavy investment in Holocaust education. And yet, it has reared its ugly head again, its return by mutating. And so, let's look at anti-Semitism and how it's evolved over time. In the Middle Ages, Jews were hated because of their religion. In the 19th and 20th century, Jews were hated because of their race, because it was out of fashion to single out a specific religion. Today, anti-Semitism has mutated again, and Jews are now hated because of the nation state, the state of Israel. Now, criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitic, because I can tell you that I don't know of one Israeli that doesn't criticize Israel. But to deny the right of Jews to exist as Jews with the same rights as everyone else, that is very much anti-Semitic. And so the carriers of anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages, at least in Europe with the churches, later it became the national culture, such as in France with the Dreyfus affair, for those who are familiar with it, and later on with Nazism in Germany. A bit of a national culture, if you may say so. Today, the biggest spreader, the carrier of anti-Semitism, is the internet. And that can influence very small minority who can perpetrate, God forbid, the most horrible attacks. Now, the really bad way of responding to anti-Semitism is to allow ourselves to be dismayed by it. We can go and say the world hates us. And, that makes us feel good about ourselves. Okay, let's get back to our life. But of course, that's not the right way to deal with it. I'd like to suggest that one of the best responses to anti-Semitism is for the Jew to say, it's quite counterintuitive, but for the Jew to say, you know what, let me participate in the fight against Islamophobia. And so that way, I can ask my Muslim friend to join me in the fight against anti-Semitism, because this is really a global effort. You see, the victim cannot fight the crime. The hated cannot cure the hate. And so I am willing to fight Islamophobia. I'm willing to fight racism. And you, my Muslim friends, my Christian friends, my Sikh friends, Zoroastrian friends, my Baha'i friends, you, please come and help to fight together with me anti-Semitism. So we need to reframe anti-Semitism, because we would make a terrible mistake if we think anti-Semitism is only about the Jews. It isn't. If you actually look in the book of Esther, in the story of Purim, this is a book that's part of the scriptures of the Old Testament. Over there you'll find the story of one of our arch enemies, Haman, who tried to destroy us because he said we were different than all the other nations. Jews refused to dilute themselves into the dominant culture and to convert themselves to the dominant religion. And so we were singled out because we were different, but aren't we all different? We are all different. But difference is what makes us human. And that is what makes us irreplaceable. So we need to understand that anti-Semitism starts with the Jew, but it never ends with the Jew. And that is the reason why we must stand together. That is the reason why members of all religions have to come and rally around the common cause of fighting racism and how we should protect and help each other. What is anti-Semitism? Let us reframe it. Let us call it a crime against humanity because of our inability to make space for difference. So I'd like to suggest here another very important point, and that is that as Jews, and I say this all the time, we cannot allow anti-Semitism to define our identity. We're not the anti-Semitic Jew. What makes the core of my identity is my spiritual heritage, is my values. And that is how I define myself. And so don't internalize anti-Semitism. Don't internalize Islamophobia. It happens to Jews, it happens to Muslims, but that is not who we are. So dear friends, I hope and pray that this gathering will pave the way for more breakthroughs in fighting the scourge of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and showing the world that it is actually feasible by exporting our Singaporean model of coexistence, harmony, and respect for one another. I wish you all the very best of luck and success in all your endeavors.
The rabbi sends his regards. He's unable to be here today, but I think that was a very powerful message, and especially one where I heard him call for the Jews to fight together with our Muslim brothers and sisters and vice versa against the scourge of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Before I hand the mic off, I'd just like to quote an oft-repeated saying from Martin Niemöller, who was a prominent Lutheran pastor in Germany, and he emerged as an outspoken critic of Hitler. Martin Niemöller spent the last 7 years of his life in concentration camps. And he said this, which I think is very apt for today. He said, "First they come for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." On that note, let me hand the mic over.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you to the Rabbi for that very powerful message. So we heard some very pertinent points about how anti-Semitism is not just about religious hatred. It intersects with race as well as politics and nation-state of Israel. And it's also not an exclusively Jewish problem. And we heard how the Rabbi said we have to stand together with our Jewish friends to combat anti-Semitism and other forms of religious hatred. Now I would like to pass the mic over to Ms. Oki to comment on religious discrimination and more generally on Islamophobia.
This book launch and discussion is so timely because, as you maybe already know, in Indonesia, just recently, there were 2 terrorist attacks. The first one is just last week. It happened in Makassar, newlywed. So it just in the early of 20s, they bombed a church in Makassar, and it's a suicide bombing. And several days later, there is a shooting in police headquarters in Jakarta. It was a girl in early 20s, and yes, she shot the police, and the police shot her back, and she was killed. And the most interesting thing is the 2 terrorists, both in Makassar and in Jakarta, they left message. They left letter to their family, and when we read the letter, we can learn what the root of the attack, what the reason behind the terrorism. And I can conclude it because of the hatred. It's because of the hate. And at least there are 4 hatred that it was written in the letter. First is hate to other religion, because it's literally written to the family and to the parents, to the brother and sister, please don't believe to other people, to other religion people, to Christian politician. Even in one letter, she mentioned literally the name of the politician, Christian politician. So it was written in the letter. So first, the reason of the bombing is the hate against other religion. And the second is hate against democracy. So both in the letter written in the Makassar and in Jakarta, the actor said that we should not involve in the election because election aim to create a system, a law system that against Islam, that it will compete with the law, Islamic law, something like that. So it hate against democracy. And the third is hate against authority. So I quote what they read is, don't believe in Togut government. They use the word of Togut. And the fourth is the hate against the economic system. So we know that in some of part of Islamic people, they really hate or they really against interest, riba. So it was written in the both letter that don't borrow money to bank and don't ever involve in any economic system, and even you have to resign from your job, whatever your job, even it's a public servant. So that's the four message written both in the letter in Jakarta bombing, Jakarta shooting, and in Makassar bombing. So what we can learn from the message from the letter, we know that it's about belief. So the terrorists, the actor, believe that what they do, it's part of jihad. It's part of religion duty. It's mandatory for her obligation for them as a Muslim to do that. Even they wrote message to their family, so the family can be following what they have done. So for me, I believe that when we're talking about Islamophobia or we're talking about prejudice, we also have to seek the root of the hatred. And we cannot deny that it's part of the belief system itself. So I myself, I work in a literary field as a novelist, and I really believe that one of the effort we can do to correct or to critically examine our belief system is to give critical education, to give opportunity to our younger generation to think, to question, to doubt. And the fact that the actor is the young millennial in the early 20s, it's also new thing we should embrace, that the hate, that the misinterpretation of the religious teaching, it's been adopted by the younger generation. Even though we are living in the technology era, we are living with so many modern tools, but we have to compete with the with the dogmatics and misinterpretation of the religious teaching. So yeah, there is no other choice except to give critical education, to open critical dialogue, especially to the younger generation. And I just learned also, because I received a message from NUS about the attempt to attack in Singapore. If I'm not wrong, the person, the actor, is also the younger generation, right? So we can discuss it more deeper later. Thank you.
Thank you, Oki. So now we're going to have a short discussion before we open the floor to Dr. Paul Hedges. I'll just like to pick up on the point that Chief Rabbi shared about how, as a Jew, we need to stand up with our Muslim friends against Islamophobia, and Muslims should also stand up with the Jews against anti-Semitism. So, Ben, I'd like to ask you, what do you think is the first step to do that? I mean, we talk about having education for the young and critical education, like Prof. Yaacob mentioned and Olki also mentioned, but what kind of education and how do we even start building these relationships and bridges to make sure that we can stand together against all this religious hatred?
It's a great question. I think, I think in Singapore, when I look back at my life, I've lived here my whole life. I'm fifth generation Singaporean. I went to local schools. I was in an Anglican school. I went into national service. So I've really led a very Singaporean life. And I cannot, for the life of me, recall any particular anti-Semitic conversation or any anti-Semitic moment that I've ever really had in Singapore. With the exception perhaps of being in school where, and I believe Imran mentioned this in his introduction where, some younger kid said, the Jews killed Jesus, right? And that was obviously an uncomfortable moment. And I was like, hey, what happened? How come the Jews killed Jesus? I thought it was the Romans. So, that was really the only time as a child, as a young person that I had encountered anti-Semitism. Haven't since then, honestly. I do know that there have been some accounts of anti-Semitism in, some of the international schools. I've heard some accounts of that. But by and large, in Singapore, nothing, with the exception of the recent attack that was reported in the papers, or thwarted attack that was reported in the papers. So I think that's very important to establish. It is something that we're very aware of globally, but locally it's something that we have had the blessing of not really having to come face to face with. In terms of working with our Muslim brothers and sisters, I think there are a couple of ways. First, we need to seek each other out, and that's not always an easy thing to do. First of all, there are not many Jews in Singapore. That's a logistical issue. But I think if the will is there, then I think the connections should be made, and I think it can be quite fast, the connections, because at the end of the day, the religion and the culture is actually quite similar. There are a lot of commonalities between Islam and Judaism. Dietary laws, lots of things. So the connections between these two people and these two religions can be done quite quickly. I think the content or the objective of the working together to counter anti-Semitism and Islamophobia really has to be along the lines of education, the youth, as you've pointed out, and online. I think anything that we try to do between two or three or a group of people should be amplified on the online space. And I think we have tools available to us, and I think we're all quite savvy. Even today's Facebook live stream. I think whatever our interactions are, whatever our sharings are, let's share it with the wider community that might not have the courage or the interest to show up, but that will certainly pick up some of these digital assets and learn from them.
Okay, do you have any comments about maybe anti-Semitism in Indonesia in particular?
Yes, I would like to comment about that. It's interesting to see that in Singapore between Muslim and Jewish, there is no problem because it's quite common. But in Indonesia, when we're talking about the relationship between Muslim and Jewish, it's always about prejudice. So Muslim always see Jewish with the suspicious and or with the every wrong stereotype about Jewish. It was part of Muslim belief when we talk about Jewish. In Indonesia, there is no. I mean, Jewish position is not like Shia or Ahmadis. We don't consider it as. I mean, the majority of dominant Muslim don't see it as deviant, but we see that as not friend, as that Jewish is not our friend. So I think for this we should give better understanding. We should give another imagery of Jewish. I don't know why a Muslim see Jewish in a very wrong way in Indonesia. Maybe because of the Israel-Palestine relationship. So I think when we talk about the relationship Jewish and Muslim in Indonesia, first we should give understanding that between Jewish and Israel as a government, it's a different thing. So Jewish as a belief and Israel as a government is not same. That's one example to start our dialogue about the relationship. Thank you.
If I may add on the issue of education, I just want to make 2 points. I think education is important, and I speak only on the context of Singapore. I'm not expert in Indonesia and the rest of the world. I think education is something which we should take seriously from the day the child is born to when we grow up. And it's just something that we should do not just as part of the institution, but also as part of the family. This should be actually embedded in family education, to respect the others, to appreciate that there are people who are different from us, but it doesn't mean they pose a danger to us. It's a question of how you build that appreciation. So that's my first point. My second point is that I think in Singapore, we have handled the security issue very well. If you look from what the government has done, there's a whole range of efforts, from RRG, the various programs and what have you, because we have always seen it as a security issue. I would think now is the time for us to see this as an educational issue in which the government can take the lead. I would encourage this as something which for our government leaders to think about. And I think when I was in government, it was something that we always thought how this can be done without a top-down effort, but something that can be organic and growing up, basically, right? Because in Singapore, it's such a small country. And if we can set the norms and the values that we think are appropriate for our context, and there is a lot of government support, I think we can do it, basically, right? And it's something in which you can leave it to the civil society group, you can leave it to various groups, but I think the government involvement is really necessary in the sense of giving it credence, giving it that level of acceptance. We have done well, as I said, for the security issue, but I think looking at this issue from an educational lens will also require the role of government together with civil society groups. And I think that would be something which we can think about, but I would certainly think that I think is something which is possible only in Singapore. I speak only on behalf of Singapore. I'm not familiar with the other context because I think there's a certain commitment to continue to hold together the peace and the coexistence that we have in Singapore. And if we just pursue the security angle, I think it's always, you're always in a state of tension, but if you pursue from an educational lens, it's really about learning one another, appreciating each other, which we do in many different ways with the Religious Harmony Day that you have in the schools, but I think you need to do this a bit more across the whole of society.
And what about the role of social media? I mean, you can do that in schools, but you have all this external influences, and maybe like both of you could comment on that also, on what you see on the social media landscape. It's not just what you learn from schools, but it's also the influences you get from elsewhere, and how does that affect?
We're not about to close the social media, right? We're an open economy, and I think it's really about, through the educational program, to build resilience in our young, to be able to differentiate what is right and what is wrong. Inevitably, some will slip through. That is a fact of life. I think the various faith communities know that, in a way, we have to do something about guiding our young, mentoring them in such a way that they appreciate that there are materials out there that we shouldn't adopt. There are materials which are good coming from the internet that we can learn from each other. But really, it boils down to the whole value system of how you differentiate between right from wrong, right? So, I mean, I was in charge of the internet for 7 years. There were a lot of challenges, and we can't close it down. We can license some of them, but eventually, because of the nature of our society and our economy, it has to remain open. So therefore, given that as a given, the flip side is we have to be resilient in our community, in our young, in how to deal with what you come across from the internet. Actually, the vast majority of young people in Singapore are very healthy. I mean, they see social media as a platform to interact. I mean, they go on certain sites, but they don't become radical. They don't become radicalized, you know. So the radicalization process, I think, is just not about social media. There are other things happening. And so if you have to take it as a holistic approach, I think social media is just one factor. But it is here to stay. You know, it is now a very important part of our economy, right, in terms of the openness to the internet. So we have to live with it, but to live with it in such a way that we can navigate it successfully, not just for the young, but also for every members of the Singaporean society.
Okay, maybe I want to add about the government involvement. Yes, I agree that in this thing, government involvement is necessary. But I would like to give two examples in Indonesia, government intervention. And the two is, the first was bad and the second maybe is good. So in 2006, there is a joint ministerial decree in Indonesia, regulate how we can build worship place. This is a very bad regulation by government, I think. Because based on the regulation, if you want to have a worship place, you have to get at least 60 agreement from those who have a different faith. It means if you are Christian, if you want to build church, you have to get at least 60 agreement from the neighborhood who has the different, from Muslim or from Buddhist, etc. And the impact is, it will be very difficult in Indonesia nowadays to build church. And it happened, there are so many church become dispute when every time when people try to do worship in the church, people will come and persecute, and yeah, it's still happening until today. It was because of the decree of 2006. But just recently, the joint minister issued another decree that regulate, that ban school to make wearing jilbab as mandatory. I think that was a very important and very good effort from the Indonesian government. So now the government want to make sure everybody can choose whether they want to wear tudung or not. Because the situation is very different with the Singapore. In Singapore, when you attend public school, you don't wear jilbab. But in Indonesia, the situation is like opposite. If you come to any region in Indonesia and you visit public school, most of the students will be wearing jilbab. And in several regions, it become mandatory. Even when it is not written, but the teacher will encourage student. And it happened in many places, it become issue. And that's why the government respond to give to issue the decree that it's a part of a student choice to wear or not to wear. And the second one is about the social media. The recent fact, it shows us that when we talk about terrorism, for so long we believe that terrorism is always related with the economic status. People with a poor condition, lower class, something like that. But the recent fact, it shows that the terrorists come from the educated middle class. Even in the Makassar bombing, the terrorists own what is this? Rent house. So it means he comes not from the poor family. He has he has house to be rented. And when we see what happened in social media, those who campaign about hijrah and anti-riba, it always come from the Middle East. But middle class. And what I want to say also here, it's not necessarily bad when you do hijrah or when you do campaign against riba, but when the position or when the belief and then turn into extremism, that's part of the problem. I think that's.
Thank you, Oki, and thank you, Ben. I have some questions, but I'll hold that till our question and answer session later. For now, we'll have Associate Professor Paul Hedges to talk about his book, Religious Hatred, Prejudice, Islamophobia, and Anti-Semitism in Global Context. Professor Hedges, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Sheila. I'd like to start off by thanking Imran for the invitation, and of course Gwazi and Sifu for organising this event. And of course I'm also very grateful to Jakub, Ben, Oki and Sheila for being here as well and taking part of this. I should also give thanks as well to Bloomsbury as the publishers, and in particular Laurel Pursglove, who was my commissioner and editor and supported this from the start, as well as Lily, who worked with this, and also in the audience there is Luca, who was my research assistant, and this book would not have been finished without Luca's help, and he helped me a lot with this. Now, the first thing I'd like to mention is why did I write this book? And compared to most of the books I've written, I had a great urgency to write this book. And actually, I think it's the fastest book I've ever written, from me first putting pen to paper, or fingers to keyboard, I should say, to actually sort of coming out was about 1.5 years, which is an extremely short time for an academic book. And it came out partly from the middle of 2019, in the summer. I was in Oxford. There was a faculty seminar there on critical anti-Semitism. And during that time, we were discussing anti-Semitism, but from some of the speakers, I was sensing, and this goes back to what Ben was saying, if you like, bits of Islamophobia sort of seeping into what they were saying. And I thought, well, this is not right. You can't just stand against one prejudice and at the same time sort of support or give implicit support to other forms of prejudice. And so I came to the conclusion, if you like, that we can't talk about anti-Semitism without talking about Islamophobia, at least. Of course, there's many other prejudices which intersect with this. But that's sort of partly what led me into writing this book. And also, as I was looking around, I found there was lots of literature on anti-Semitism, literature on Islamophobia, and literature on prejudice studies, particularly around race or misogyny. But there wasn't really anything sort of bringing all of these together. So to some extent, I was trying to sort of fill a gap in the literature as well by writing this. But also, there's this sense of urgency. It came to me that this was like this burning thing. And in a sense, I shouldn't have written this book. I have lots of other projects I was working on. But somehow I thought, well, I just have to get this out there. This needs to be there. And of course, sitting in Singapore, again, it may seem sort of insignificant. And the fact that, of course, basically, let's just say month this book comes out, that we've seen, if you like, the news of the attempt to attack the synagogue here, and of course Islamophobia is a huge global problem as well. And of course, we should mention as well the attempted attack on the Christians as well, as part of this. There are many sort of forms of prejudice out there. Now, in bringing them together, there's also like part of my sort of personal sort of research trajectory in this, because what I mainly work on is interreligious relations. And to some extent, if you work in interreligious relations, you look at dialogue, you look at attempts to sort of promote harmony. My early work sort of looked, if you like, at sort of Christian sort of missionary writings. And some of this, of course, is quite polemical. But still in that, there's a sense, if you like, to understand the other. But I was kind of growing to a sense that, like, you can't really understand, if you like, the more positive dynamics without understanding, if you like, the inverse side of this. What are the negative sort of dynamics with this? So for some time, if you like, I've been looking at this. I think it's perhaps partly because I'm in RSIS. And of course, while I'm in the school on interreligious relations, just next door, we've got a centre on terrorism studies. So these were sort of natural questions which came together. And of course, part of the interest in Singapore in why we have a centre on interreligious relations is because, we do the upstream work to make sure that the terrorism people have less work to do. So these are intimately sort of bound together in this. So all of this, if you like, sort of led me into sort of writing this book. I'd also mention, of course, perhaps some personal sort of aspects of this. And again, this comes back to sort of education. Because if you like, for a long time, if you like, as an academic working on this, I was aware that anti-Semitism was out there, Islamophobia was out there, But it was sometime actually during my teaching that it really sort of hit home quite how significant this is. And on the Islamophobia side, it's something that happened to me quite early on in my teaching career, that I was taking some of my students on a field trip to London Central Mosque. And I was working for Canadian University at the time, and a couple of our students had stayed the night in London, because this was like a particular campus there, and didn't come down with the rest of us. So we met the rest of them on the coach. And these students, having stayed a night in London, they knew they were going to go to the mosque. So they decided to put their headscarves on early. So they jumped on the tube for about a 5-minute journey. During that time, they were shouted out about 3 times. They were spat on the tube, coming there. And if you like, for me, again, I said intellectually, I knew there was a problem in the UK around this. But to actually sort of having spoke to 2 Canadian students, I said, these girls, they were not Muslims. They were sort of white Canadian girls, and they were, abused on the tube. I said sort of quite openly, and I said that really sort of brought home to me, sort of if you like, how much Muslims, and of course particularly female Muslims, will be affected by this on a day-to-day basis. The other part, again, in organising sort of trips, we also occasionally sort of would sometimes go to the synagogue as well, particular one in Golders Green. And it was this kind of awareness that how much extra work we had to do whenever we visited the synagogue. Every single sort of name being sort of sent on in advance. When we got there, we'd have to go through the, if you like, through the security and if you like, the metal detectors before we went in. And if you like, again, just for everybody, if you like, to visit the temple, the Gurdwara, this is like an everyday thing. But of course, for Jews in many parts of the world, it's a securitized process every time they have to walk through the doors of their place of worship. So this, if you like, sort of really, I said from my early days of teaching, started to bring home to me, sort of quite how other sort of communities were experiencing this. Perhaps just as a related point, I could have more mentioned that very recently, this last week, the British government has released a report which hasn't said that racism is over, but saying that basically, racism is no longer a thing. And I kind of wonder quite where this is coming from. I haven't read the full report yet, but at any rate, I'll leave that for the moment. So, onto the book, some key themes that I bring up. I said one of them, importantly, is understanding both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism as forms of prejudice. And one part of this, something I do in the book, is what I call to untheorize things. And again, a lot of the literature on anti-Semitism that you read, people talk about the idea of this ancient sort of global sort of hatred, that like Jews have been hated for thousands of years, and it's almost this unfathomable thing, this great sort of hatred against Jews which doesn't exist anywhere. And if we want to overcome anti-Semitism, it doesn't sort of help us to mystify it as something kind of inexplicable, this sort of spiritual, sort of transcendent sort of hatred. We only understand it where we understand it as part of human hatred. And of course, this is where it crosses over into Islamophobia. That is also, if you like, another form of human hatred. So the work of sort of Gordon Allport and his successors, and in particular in the book, I also bring up social identity theory as another sort of angle into understanding this. And alongside this, something else gets woven is, of course, sort of racism. Because today, both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism exist as sort of forms of racialized hatred. It's no longer sort of perhaps primarily about sort of the religious hatred, but the racial hatred is there as part of this. And again, to go back to my young Canadian sort of students, perhaps because they were white but were sort of looking like Muslims, something that was shouted often that they were race traitors. And this, if you like, is part of the discourse which is out there. Now, also sort of in the book, I attempt to take a global sort of perspective in this, and again, I think is hopefully that I'm bringing in. Because, of course, particularly anti-Semitism, there's a long sort of Western sort of history out of this, coming out of sort of Christianity. And so again, the fact that we're sort of here on Easter Day, and Imran sort of mentioned this, and of course the rabbi sort of mentioned this, it's incredibly apposite, because historically, this last week would have been one of the most dangerous weeks of the year for the Jewish community across Europe. On Good Friday, and of course this accusation that the Jews killed Jesus was dead, is this charge of deicide, of killing God. was there, and it was sort of a routine violence would have taken place against Jewish communities for a long time. For well over 1,000 years across sort of Europe, around about this time of year. So being here on Easter Day, I think, is incredibly sort of symbolic as part of this. But I said, within this sort of global perspective, I mean, other aspects of sort of hatred, not just, if you like, sort of Christian hatred of Jews and Christian sort of hatred of Muslims is there, but also I took a sort of, Buddhist Islamophobia and Hindu Islamophobia, and also Islamic anti-Semitism. And of course, some of that has been discussed already. But of course, this global perspective is also important because while I said, I don't want this book just to be about the West, to some extent, the Western Christian history is fundamental to all of this. These hatreds spread across the world in large part, at least as they're seen today, with sort of colonial expansion out of the British, the French, the Spanish, and other groups. And if you like, sort of Islamic sort of anti-Semitism, it had never been something that Muslims did. If you like, sort of Jews, like Christians, were protected people. They were sort of al-Zimma, sort of the protected people within these societies. And they lived under sort of Muslim majority sort of polities with a peace and security they did not know under Christian rule. And it was really sort of the early 20th century when these sort of narratives were sort of spread through sort of colonial sort of rulers out to them. And again, sort of with the Buddhist and sort of Hindu hatreds we see today, a lot of this was sort of fermented through sort of colonial periods, and particularly with the sort of the Christian aspect as well. And myself sort of coming from an Anglican background, I have to sort of acknowledge that, as a Christian, I am in large part sort of responsible for, this history and what has sort of taken place within this. Now, the final part of the book I'd sort of like to talk about is the theory of violence, because, of course, prejudice on its own, if it was just a dislike or sort of not giving people jobs, it would be a bad thing in itself. But of course, perhaps the most awful aspect of this is it often sort of gives rise to violence. Most notably, perhaps, of course, sort of the Holocaust, the killing of sort of around about 5-6 million Jews in Europe during sort of the Second World War. But of course, much prejudice doesn't lead into direct violence. So also in this book, I try to sort of attempt to understand sort of what leads towards this. And again, this term I used before, sort of untheorizing, I talk about that in relation to genocide. Because again, if you read a lot of things of genocide, it's this almost unimaginable, unfathomable sort of thing that takes place. But actually, if you look at the dynamics, it's possible to sort of see how we sort of lead up to it. And unfortunately, like prejudice, genocide, and I'll explain what I say to this, is a natural and normal aspect of human societies. Now, of course, I don't mean we all go around killing each other all the time or hating each other, but because of the way we are as human beings, we sort of pick out sort of differences in groups, we point at sort of certain sort of people, and this sort of leads into forms of dislike. Again, because of the types of creatures we are, in certain social, political, economic situations, this will lead on to violence. And the narratives that tie all of this together into genocide, I can't say we can always predict them very clearly, but you can watch the patterns taking place. So back to like as a study of interreligious relations, we can sort of map out sort of, what forms to some extent sort of good relations. We can also map out what are the negative relations. And again, this comes back to the education question. It's important that people sort of understand where prejudice sort of comes from, where our inclinations to violence sort of come from. And of course, if we understand this, it's much easier to stop them. Because of course, to some extent, we're all prejudiced ourselves. We can't help it. We've got human brains. We will develop sort of in-groups and out-groups. This is natural. But to understand how and why this takes place, we can then work against it in ourselves, in our societies, in our communities. So again, that is sort of part, if you like, of the work of this book. I think perhaps if I just sort of draw perhaps a few other thoughts from the speakers here, perhaps I'm in fact to Jakob's opening, again, you mentioned it's taking place at all levels of society. And I said that's absolutely essential for this. It's not just about academics thinking about this, but I said in schools, in families, the media as well, and of course social media has been a very big sort of vector in this. And I think there's a lot of work now that social media companies are coming to realise sort of how much responsibility they do bear for allowing narratives to be spread freely within this. Again, to understand sort of prejudice, there is a logic to it, but it's also sometimes quite illogical. As the sort of rabbi was saying, if you like, anti-Semitism is full of sort of contradictions. But this again becomes part of the problem. Almost anything you can blame against the Jews, the Christians, the 1%, whoever it is you want to sort of pick out, prejudice or the way prejudice works allows this to take place. And if we can sort of pick out, there is no reason for anybody to hate Jews or Muslims or anybody else in and of themselves, and certainly not as a generic group, then, again, we can start to unpick this within our societies as well. Again, sort of, Oki, you sort of mentioned again these narratives of these particular sort of figures. And again, I said there's always history sort of behind this. Why have they come to having these points of view? So again, sort of working through that and coming back to these narratives, incredibly important. I think I'd like to leave more time for discussion, so I'll end up here. But thank you again to everyone for being here and our audience as well.
Thank you, Professor Hedges. So I think you guys have a copy of the book, or you can get it later, right? We have copies here. So right now we'll move on to question and answer session. So I'll open it up to the floor. If anybody has any questions, we'll pass the mic around. I'll also see if we have any questions from our viewers at home or wherever you guys are. Any questions? Okay.
Hi, congratulations, Paul. I'm picking up a point from Rabbi where he said that people who look like him tend to go through that experience of hate or anti-Semitism, right? So there is this element of identity, the visible identity, which seems to contribute to the manifestation of the prejudice, right? And, right now also, it's a time where a lot of countries are also looking at, banning the burqa, and, we're also now having a conversation about, how the headscarf itself could, contribute to people, acting on their prejudice. And your chapter does speak about can we regulate religious hatred? Well, law does protect people from the violent attack of it. Taking from former Minister Jakob's point, do you think the top-down approach from the government will still continue to help in really countering this prejudice that's quite deep set and targets quite specifically at people who are, visibly practicing their faith? Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the question, Fahima. Yes, absolutely. If like sort of definitions of particular prejudices, I said particularly sort of Islamophobia. It's normally, people who are Muslims or perceived to be Muslims. So again, like my students, it doesn't matter what you are. And of course, in the aftermath of 9/11 in the USA, many of the people attacked were Sikhs. Because for your average American, you see somebody wearing a turban, you don't understand who Sikhs are, you don't understand who Muslims are, so you simply go out and attack or kill these people. And actually Sikhs still continue to suffer from this today, because particularly as you go through airports, you get securitized, you get pulled over, and lots of Sikhs are still pulled over today on the assumption that they are Muslims. So yes, this identity aspect is incredibly important to understand sort of prejudice. I think it doesn't matter who you are, what you are, it's the perception of you that fuels this. Now, the second part of your question, I said, is about the legal aspect to this. And here again, I should particularly thank my research assistant, Luca. He's actually a trained lawyer as well, so very useful to have him on my team as I was writing about the legal aspects of this. Yes, I think absolutely the top-down part is essential. Without sort of functioning laws in place, you will not be able to stop attacks taking place. You will not be able to stop incidents of it. Now, that of course does not stop prejudice. People can still have these hatreds within themselves. They can have the prejudice there. It can exist structurally within society at all sorts of levels, despite sort of the legal apparatus. And I said, yes, it can stop attacks. It can also sort of help with employment, because of course employment is sometimes a place. And if we were in sort of 1930s Germany, if a Jew walks in, no, I'm not going to employ you, you're Jewish. It was perfectly legal to do that. And of course, lots of prejudices still are legalized in certain places. So yes, law is incredibly important. But as you said, it is a blunt tool. It can only go so far. So that's why, if you like, we need this whole of society approach through sort of education. I mean, Jakub sort of mentioned, if you like, within families as well. Of course, that's much, much harder to get to. And again, there is sort of research sort of on this, particularly with sort of younger children. No matter what happens at school, if they go home and hear their parents, sort of repeating these sort of, stereotypical sort of tropes about people, the school education is only going to have a limited effect on this. And again, as children get older into their teens, their peers and social media all play an incredibly large part of this. And this is why, you really need, I said, a much sort of broader sort of, if you like, attempt. It can't simply be top-down. It has to come up through the communities, sort of through respected sort of leaders, through educators, sort of religious sort of teachers. It has to be sort of everywhere. And of course, having the media online as well. Because again, in many countries, even if you've got the laws in place, if the politicians say the right thing, if you've got a media that's still sort of, spreading anti-Semitic or sort of Islamophobic stuff, then it's going to be there within society. So yeah, law alone will not solve the problem.
Do we have any other questions from the floor?
I just want to find out what moves the prejudice, because you can have a prejudice which is just inside you and you don't express it. And then you can actually express it out through microaggressions or acts. And then it moves to action. So can you tell us a bit more about this process? Because usually people would just, think it in their minds and we won't act it out. But what would catalyze this action taking to move it to a point where you actually go and do harm to other people? And I think that would help us understand what is the larger issue that we are looking at.
Okay, thank you, Gwat. Yeah, that's an excellent question. Going back to Gordon Allport, he wrote, if you like, the foundational book for prejudice studies. And he set out sort of a scale within this, if you like, where it starts off like just as talk. Because, of course, we don't tend to just have prejudices in ourselves. It's come from somewhere, if you like, from friends, from family or something. So, there's just sort of talk, there's avoidance of people. There's then, if you like, where we seek to act to sort of implement prejudice against people, and then into violence, and then finally into sort of genocide and pogroms. Now, to some extent, if you like, that it's not, if you like, a simple progression. You don't just simply sort of like start saying bad things about somebody and then sort of get led into actions and then onto violence. It doesn't sort of work in a linear sort of way. And this could be a very long answer to your question, but there's all sorts of layers that could sort of come into this. There's one, if you like, there's the social sort of factor, what's happening in society. There's also, if you like, the personal sort of psychological sort of aspects, because again, even if I've got prejudice against somebody, like for most humans, we're not going to go out and sort of physically attack them. You might really hate and detest your boss and not like them, but you're not going to go into work one day and punch him in the face. We've got psychological barriers that stop us from sort of causing harm to other people. So, there's the social, there's the psychological sort of aspects which all sort of tie into this. But as a first point, I'd like to sort of come back to one thing that's come out in prejudice studies. There is no such thing as benign bigotry. Also, there's no benign bigotry. Because, again, while I said it's not a linear sort of pattern to this scale, as soon as we start, if you like, well, either sort of speaking badly about somebody or simply with our actions showing sort of contempt for them. And again, just sort of an example, suppose like a mother of her young child sees somebody of a particular skin colour or ethnic group they don't like, so they cross the road to avoid them. She doesn't say anything to that child, but that child picks this up. These are people to be avoided. And of course, these small actions in society set a stage where a certain group is pushed apart, particularly when you've got majority-minority situations going on. And all of that lays the groundwork for everything else. So, with this sort of taking place, you see this sort of taking place. Now, normally for it to become sort of, if you like, a wider thing, I said you need, if you like, something in place, either the media or politicians, setting the narratives in place. So, I mean, Nazi Germany, you've got this sort of taking place. Of course, you've got 2,000 years of narrative that set the Jews as the scapegoat. They've been blamed sort of for everybody's economic woes. They've been blamed for sort of killing God. There's lots of reasons, at that time, why people would sort of have a dislike towards sort of Jews anyway. And of course, it's a time when there's a lot of sort of social economic unrest. Sort of after the First World War, Germany was still sort of suffering. And, a leader comes out who specifically targets that particular minority. We can put all the blame onto this group. And again, I said, if like this benign bigotry, these simple sort of things and these narratives have laid the groundwork for that. And then if you like, as well, you're in a sort of fairly sort of fraught sort of situation. You have to normalize violence in society or normalize it in groups. Just to slightly go off track here, again, it's one reason why lots of people who talk about sort of as radicalized, like who go on to become sort of terrorist acts, they've often been involved in petty crime first. Because if you're involved in petty crime, you're used to violence as a way of life. The steps, if you like, from seeing violence as something you do on an everyday basis, up to sort of, chopping somebody's head off or whatever it may be, you've started on that path already. So again, violence has to be normalized within society. And I said political actors can do this, the media can do this. And then, you sort of see the progression on from this. I said with individuals, because of course we do sometimes see particular individuals acting this out. Again, you've then got particular sort of psychological sort of pathways into this. And it's often like a process, of, grooming is a term that's sort of sometimes sort of used. They've been exposed to violence sort of taking place, particularly sort of Jewish, sort of Muslim. You show these people, what's violence against sort of Palestinians sort of taking place, take out a wider context, and you show them particularly that kind of violence. And again, if you show people violence all the time and told them this is what's happening to your sort of, your compatriots elsewhere, you can lead people. I mean, it's not an obvious thing. Just because we see violence, we don't go out and do violence ourselves. But with certain individuals, you have to sort of give them the narratives, and I said the social context for this to take place.
What can I add? Of course, I defer to Paul as the expert here, but I just want to share. I think one of the underlying things that feeds into the prejudice is any kind of underlying myths that you have in society. We take it as a given. Of course, you can read a famous book by the late Professor Alatas on the myth of the lazy native. But once that becomes socialized in society and accepted, right, that's how people then behave. One group is good in math, the other group is not good in math. One is much more creative than the others. I think these are kinds of things that we grew up with, we see as something very innocent, but they actually form the basis of that sort of prejudice belief, basically. We have to deal with that in a sensible way and to sort of remove some of those things so that people can understand that if you are like me, I'm sure you are a God-fearing person, that God has created all of us equal. It's just a matter of opportunities to excel or not. No? I've always remembered this joke when I was growing up that Malays make the best barbers because we are very creative. So I asked the question, how do 1 billion Chinese got their haircut in China? I mean, there are no creative barbers in China. But, it is something that grew out of a special context in Singapore where Malays were not well educated and they could go into profession which was very easy in terms of entering that, and hair cutting. Well, I don't want to say my barbers are not good, they're good, but people can learn the trade very quickly and it's not difficult for them to get into that trade, and all of a sudden you see a proliferation of Malay barbers. And people forget when I was growing up, it's actually were Indian barbers who were around a lot more, basically, and I grew up in a kampung where Indian barbers were actually the norm rather than Malay barbers. So, in every generation you go through certain things and you accept it as part of life, and as Paul mentioned, kids pick this up, simple things that you don't go to a barber except Malay barber because they're creative. I'm not saying we shouldn't go to Malay barbers, but I think the underlying text is very important for us to understand, to remove some of this thinking that there are certain special allocation of races and so on and so forth. So I think it's also dealing with some of the underlying myths which are present, that we take it as part and parcel of our lives, but it actually informs our behavior, and actually, in fact, in a way, sometimes anchor further the prejudices that we may have of one another.
I would like to add about what we can do to stop prejudice. I think instead of preserving or retelling the myths, the stereotype, the prejudice, we should start creating the new stories, the new ones, the new narrative, like about the story about bombing. If we keep retelling our children that the bombing, it's always wearing burqa, and then we continue the prejudice towards those who are wearing burqa. And if we telling the same stories about the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, we will trap in the same prejudice. So I think it's very important for parents, for family, and of course education system to take action and start new stories.
That's a nice segue into the next question. Can I get this question online first? Okay. So we have a question for Professor Hedges, but I think all our other panelists can answer this as well. What is the relationship between hatred and prejudice, which is a matter of affect and feeling, and the commitment to education, which is a matter of information and reason?
Okay, thank you for that. Now, in contemporary prejudice studies, prejudice is normally split into three parts. There's what we call stereotype, which are like the stories, the narratives, sort of these myths you've been telling us. And if like these are a common stock that we all know, and some people accept them, other people sort of don't accept them, but they're all part of our general knowledge. There is then another part, and confusingly this is called prejudice. So part of prejudice is called prejudice, and if like this is the emotive aspect of it, that feeling of sort of disgust or hatred or something else. The third aspect is discrimination, which like is acts based on the previous two. So, if you like, hatred is not the same thing as prejudice. I mean, just to sort of have a hatred of something, it is not necessarily prejudiced against that. I mean, all sorts of things can make you angry. And of course, hatred itself is a very complex emotion. And again, we have different hatreds in different sort of situations. And even in terms of sort of prejudice, the way that sort of hatred might manifest in us against any particular group, which our sort of whole society has, can be different in each person. So hatred is not the whole part of it. And of course, with prejudice, it's sometimes, I said, it's maybe not so much hatred as so simply like a disgust of something. Those people make me sick or whatever it is, rather than like this violent sort of hot anger that we might associate with hatred. So, yeah, I said hatred sort of feeds into this, and particularly sort of when we get, if you like, sort of violence enacted, then normally sort of hatred has become sort of part of this mix. But it is quite distinct, if you like, from prejudice itself. Also, it forms a part of it. Coming down, if I like, to the question around sort of education here. Yeah, I mean, to some extent, I said what education sort of has to deal with, and I think sort of Oki has sort of hit this on the head on the last point, if like, is these new narratives that, as you said, like if we keep telling the same stories about people, and particularly around these stereotypes, then these things are still there in our societies. And again, this becomes sort of a key as well, because I said, to some extent, we all know these stereotypes. There are stereotypes, in Singapore of the Chinese, Malays, Indians, but we don't all buy into them. However, at the same time, they're there in the backs of our minds. And particularly at times of stress, our thinking sort of goes slightly awry. It's very easy for things to sort of come, up to the forefront of our minds and become sort of something that we buy into in particular sort of situations. So, we have to, yes, change these stories which our society is telling. So education is key in that. But I said also to understand, if you like, the mechanisms of prejudice, of why we sort of have dislikes towards sort of particular groups. That it's not about that group ourselves, and very often, like, prejudice tells us far more about ourselves than it does about the people we hate. Because I said, like, particularly sort of now in sort of Europe, Muslims are seen as this sort of unassimilable sort of minority. They're sort of, overpopulating the place. 19th century, exactly the same things were said about the Jews. But now Muslims have simply taken that place. They've fitted into that group. So, if we understand, that how we're sort of forming these negative sort of impressions of other groups, and the fact that these are not true at all, has to be a key part of this, I think.
Have a question from the floor?
Yeah, I see tremendous value in the study of religious hatred and even racial prejudice that could extend to other forms of prejudice. And, things like class, gender, sexuality, even political views, right? Prejudice against that. And something new that I'm starting to notice in society is a prejudice against personality types and disposition. I work in the social sector. There is a very odd, almost humorous growing prejudice against logical personality types, right, by very emotional personality types. And they are very, it seems almost vehement in the social sector. So my question is basically, with so much specialization and historical experience of religious and racial discrimination, what can we learn from racial and religious prejudice that can extend to these other surfacing forms of prejudice that are growing in our society now?
Okay, thank you for the question. As I said, so importantly, I said for both of these, we have to understand that both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are forms of prejudice. And exactly the same, I said, applies. The same mechanisms that lead people into anti-Semitism and Islamophobia lead them into misogyny, lead them into racism, lead them into classism, lead them, I'm not sure what prejudice against personality types is called, but it leads it into that. I said, human beings are human beings, and the way we hate, the way we have prejudice is common sort of all the way through, sort of, if you like. I mean, obviously there are some differences in how this is manifest, sort of depending upon sort of geography or region, probably sort of gender as well in various ways, but there's enough commonality there to speak about this generically. So yes, I mean, prejudice sort of studies leads us into all of that. But actually what you've said, it wants me to sort of bring up a very big, long intellectual sounding term, which is intersectionality. Now, intersectionality, it basically, well, at least as I'm sort of using it here out of its original sort of usage, means that forms of sort of prejudice often sort of hit most severely at the intersections between them. So the classic example, if you like, out of Kimberly Crenshaw, who sort of coined this term, is around sort of black women. And this is in America. They suffer prejudice because they're black. They suffer prejudice because they're women. But it's black women who get hit the hardest by this. And I was really shocked a couple of years ago when I heard some statistics. A man called Biko Agazino, if I've got his name right, he's a professor of criminology he's American, but he'd done a study in the UK, and he discovered, I mean, the figure is shocking. I don't have it off the top of my head, but it's something like sort of 80-90% of black women in British prisons are there for one crime. That one crime is possession of marijuana, and we're talking about small individual amounts. Now, of course, in the UK, you don't put people in prison for personal possession. Yes, if you're a dealer, you go into prison, but you won't find any white women in prison because of possession of marijuana. But I said this is why the vast majority of black women are there. So, it's an example, I said, of the way that a particular group, they've come at this sort of intersection of these various things, get hit by this. So, again, as you're sort of talking across this, yes, I mean, when you've got religion, race, class, ethnicity, whatever it else is blended together, the groups who hit sort of the most number of these, they're going to sort of be hit far worse than any other groups within this. So I said, yes. While I said I've written a book on religious sort of hatred, it's not to say that these other things don't exist. And again, as I mentioned, racism forms a key part of this, because we can't understand sort of modern forms of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia without understanding how they're racialized forms of hatred. So, yeah, that's all key within this.
One question from the floor?
Okay,
Okay, please.
Just a bit additional. So, frankly speaking, I believe that we cannot free from prejudice. That's just a fact. So, what we have to do is we have to make sure that the prejudice will not be manifested into action. So, when we're talking about prejudice in religion, how we can control our fellow, they don't make any extreme action based on their prejudice. They don't turn into violence based on prejudice. And when we talk about prejudice based sexuality, based on gender, we have to make sure there is law enforcement that can guarantee people will not make any violence based on their prejudice. So I think it just that's the fact that prejudice is still instilled in people's mind and thought.
Yeah. Can I ask a question? No, actually, I want to make a comment, and then after that, I have three questions, in fact. Firstly, I think I like the point that was made about narrative. I think it's extremely important to know where these narratives are coming from that has shaped the minds of people towards a certain tendency, anti-Semitism, for example. And I want to speak a bit more about this anti-Semitism thing. I think it was mentioned earlier that the Palestinian-Israel conflict is one of the key factors that has driven anti-Semitic sentiments amongst Muslims. But I think there's more to it than just the Palestinian-Israel context or conflict. Because we do find mentions of a certain kind of enmity towards Jewish tribe in the Quran itself, as well as in the prophetic history, right? That there was actually some form of conflicts between the Prophet and the early Muslims with some Jewish tribes. And how that is being understood and transposed to the modern context by generalizing that all Jews must be similar to the Jews that were mentioned in the Quran in a very specific incident against the Prophet, then that becomes a problem. This generalization and transposing of different contexts to situations today. And that's how it's being used to justify animosity towards all Jews. You know, for example, some years ago, I do find a book, an encyclopedia of Jews, published in Indonesia. It's sold here in a bookstore. 700 pages of anti-Semitic interpretation of history of Muslim-Jewish relations. So those kind of things are circulating, especially in the vernacular, especially in the Malay language, especially printed in Malay. And I think we need to watch out for that because those things are shaping the minds of the Malay Muslims, actually. I mean, I grew up with a lot of anti-Semitic ideas being shared, you know. Every single thing is blamed towards the Jews. In fact, even the term Yahudi has become a pejorative term that is, just thrown around. If you don't like the price of a particular thing, you say, ini harga Yahudi, or perangai Yahudi, the Jewish, way of behaving. This carries a lot of negative stereotypes. Yeah, conspiracy theory is one thing. Is the other thing. I think even recently, you find a lot of these conspiracy theories circulated, and using modern technology like YouTube, shared through WhatsApp, and some of them are being carried by religious personalities and preachers. We do know, for example, the world's problem normally will be either is the Freemason, is the Jews, or the Dajjal, the Antichrist. Somehow these three things are all conflated, and therefore there is this attempt by the Jews to rule over the world. And a lot of this actually came from the ideas that emerged from a piece of work that is still being circulated in the Muslim world, which is called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. That is a piece of forgery, and it was widely used as a propaganda, especially in Russia at the turn of the century, and that was also the basis, part of the basis for the persecution of Jews in Europe that led to the disastrous Holocaust. But now somehow Muslims are just circulating that piece of forgery, claiming that there's authenticity in that, and using that as a basis to argue that the Jews are out to control the world. And that has created a lot of, it has perpetuated the anti-Semitic ideas nowadays. The other thing is, of course, I think it's been mentioned here, and there's the lack of contact between Malay Muslims and Jews. I'm talking about this part of the world especially. When I encounter friends who have very negative views towards the Jews, I always ask them, how many Jews in person do you know? And none of them have a single Jewish friend or have any contact with any Jew. So in 2019, for example, very interestingly, I spoke to Rabbi Mordecai, and actually I brought him to Jakarta. And we met with members of the interfaith there, especially with the Indonesian Religions for Conference and Peace, ICRP, and we had a good discussion, and there were Muslims who were there, and probably that's the first time they even encountered a rabbi. So it was a very positive outcome, and then we wanted to bring an ustaz there from Indonesia, come to Singapore, and engage with the Muslim audience here to talk about his experience and context with the Jews, because he is an ustad who is teaching Hebrew language. Ben, probably you know him, Ustad Sapri. He's been to Singapore a couple of times, but I wanted to bring him here and engage the audience here, but unfortunately COVID happens, so probably we have to wait for that. So I think those kind of cross interactions are very important in person to break down the stereotypes, and then people will start to say, hey, you don't fit into this idea of the Jew that I have, you seem to be like a nice person, you don't have this grand conspiracy theory of trying to undermine Islam, and Islam is under threat because of this Jewish conspiracy going on. We have to change that narrative, and part of that is also relearning our history. In 1492, when the Jews were expelled from Granada after the Reconquista, where did they run to? They ran to the Ottoman Empire. And they were sheltered in Istanbul and various parts of the Muslim world. Why is this kind of narrative not being shared much? Maimonides, for example, and Rabbi has spoken very well on this topic during the iftar that we had last year, or was it 2019? Sorry, last year was still COVID. Where he talked about how the Jews had their golden age and the flourishing of Jewish ideas and thought right there in Andalusia, which was under the Muslim rule. Because the Jews had a certain liberty to pursue their cultural achievements and to be who they are. This kind of history, I think, needs to be rediscovered and to be taught to the new generation. And I think we are not doing that enough. So, Prof. Yaacob, maybe this is something that the Muslim community here needs to really think about on how to move that forward. Now, I have one question each for one of the panelists, if you don't mind. For Ben, I want to ask, I was very moved when Rabbi just now spoke about how the Jews must be allowed to stand with the Muslims against Islamophobia. And at the same time, also Muslims must stand with the Jews against anti-Semitism. I think that's a very powerful statement. Can you share if there are any initiatives done by the Jewish community to stand with Muslims in addressing Islamophobia? Well, maybe not here, maybe in Europe or elsewhere, anywhere. Yeah, that's one. The second one for Prof. Yaacob, you know, just like racism, there can be internalized racism. Do you see instances where Muslims have imbibed Islamophobia itself, ideas of Islamophobia, and have been Islamophobic towards their fellow Muslims? I don't know, is that a phenomenon that you're seeing, or maybe that's not a serious issue to be looked at? Just your comments and your thoughts on that. And for Oki, can you talk about Muslim oppression against minorities within their own Muslim community? And Indonesia is one good example where, you know, the Shias and the Ahmadis or any Muslims who does not fit into the mainstream ideas of what being Muslim is being persecuted or under threat as the core of their identity or being part of the Muslim community. Can you speak a little bit more about that? I don't have a question for you, Paul, but really your book has been a great contribution towards unpacking some of these ideas and clarifying some of these concepts. Thank you very much, Paul.
Imran, thanks for the question. You're totally right. It is extremely, and I was very moved when I heard Rabbi speak about this as well. It's not a subject, as you can imagine, that we talk about very often. And, you know, to hear Rabbi speak so clearly about this subject in Singapore, it's a very powerful statement. I agree with you. Globally speaking, it is never a surprise that every time there is an attack on, for example, the Christchurch mosque attack, there was an outpouring of support from all around the world, from various sectors, religions, but most of all, I was impressed to see a lot of Jewish communities all around the world, you know, standing hand in hand with their local Muslim brothers and sisters, speaking about how this was absolutely intolerable. It doesn't come to mind where there is an ongoing agenda and an ongoing program, but I'm sure it exists. I will go find it. But I think on the local front, I think it behooves us as well to start taking steps in this direction, as has been said, on a top-down level, education at the family. I think the Jewish community can also play its part. And, you know, I think in about 2 months or so, we will be launching the Jews of Singapore permanent exhibition in Singapore. It's the first permanent exhibition on Judaism and Jewish history in Singapore that has ever been put up. It'll be put up on the grounds of the Magen Aborth Synagogue at the Jacob Ballas Center. And I think one of the themes that we can explore in greater depth is the subject of anti-Semitism in Singapore, how we can overcome it, what some of these myths, tropes, and stereotypes are, and how we can perhaps stand together to counter Islamophobia, together as minority communities in Singapore. I think we have some content coming up, but I think after this discussion, you know, we can sharpen it further and be a little bit more pointed about certain ideas we want to push forward.
Why do you always ask me difficult question, Imran? I think there's no doubt about the fact that whether you call it Islamophobia or prejudice, there is always within every sect, every faith, people who differ with one another. I think that differences can be accepted, but taking Guat's point, when the differences become inherent prejudice, like for example the anti-Shia feeling and so on and so forth, I think that's not healthy. And I come back to my earlier point, just like you raised about the incident in 1492, which we only learn as adults, not as kids. I think we have to go back and relook at how, for me as a member of the Muslim community, how Islam is being taught. And, you know, when I was a minister, we tried to reform it with some degree of success. We introduced a live program. But it's really about the content and how we make sure that the content that we have is not only pervasive, but actually comes down to the fundamental point of what it means to be a Muslim, right? And if you go back to our Holy Scripture, I was having a conversation with a friend recently, and says, all the verses in the Quran that talks about doing good, helping the poor, doesn't start with, oh, you Muslim. He says, oh, you mankind, right? Only about 56 odd verses that deal with Muslim affairs of divorce, marriage, inheritance, it refers to the Muslim. So the vast majority of the text is about mankind, about what we can do together. That should be the first thing that should be taught, that we exist in this world as part of the human race, and we have to help one another, teach one another. Internally, I think we do have our own challenges, and I think I go back to the fact that I wouldn't want some kind of authority to dictate what a Muslim should be vis-a-vis other Muslims, but I think you need to also have some clarity that Shias are accepted part of the faith, a part of the community, and we should treat them with respect as we would like them to treat us with respect. So I agree with you, we have to watch this space as much as possible. Increasingly, I think among the young, I think you are the young, right, Sheila? There is this concern about how we deal with that diversity, because they are growing that diversity a lot more from my generation. When I was growing up, the Shias were some group that you're not supposed to be associated with, right? They are the group that has gone way out until you discover that's not quite true. But for the younger generation, they live in the midst of people who are basically very diverse from themselves, but regard themselves as fellow Muslims. And how do you deal with that, basically, right? So increasingly, I think our educational system will have to relook at this in a hard way. I'm talking about Islamic education. I'm sure it refers to Christians and Jews and the rest, in ensuring that the young get socialized at a very young age. How do you see the world and how see the people of other faiths, you know? I'm a firm believer of appreciating diversity, and I think we can teach that from a young age, that diversity is really what makes us all human beings, and appreciating that, I think we have something going for it. I want to go back to my earlier point about the role of government. Again, I'm not trying to put the Singapore government into the centerpiece, but I think the Singapore government has always been conscious about this and has done a lot more. But I don't like the word the top down, but I think the government also has a responsibility, which they are playing, to set the tone, the right tone for what kind of society we want to have in Singapore. We've done well in terms of the security part. I think now we have to do a lot more in terms of how we ensure what does it mean to have a peaceful society in Singapore? What is the kind of values that we appreciate one another? So the efforts by the various grassroots organizations, the Interreligious Confidence Circle that have been created, you know, after the 9/11, I think these are good effort that has to be stepped up to socialize everybody into the one notion that we are part of the same human race and we have to respect one another.
Okay. The existence of Muslim minorities in Indonesia has been a big problem, especially nowadays after 1998. I have to say that because, in fact, when we talk about Syiah in Indonesia, Ahmadis in Indonesia, they have been here since forever, since the beginning of the country. When we talk about Ahmadis, the composer of Indonesian anthem is Ahmadis. But people don't realize that, because previously we never talk about Ahmadis. We never realized that being Syiah is a sin, or being Syiah is a problem in our society. But after 1998, when there is the rising of the, actually conservatism is not bad, but when it is translated into action hating against other, that was bad, and it was legalized by the government, by the one ulama authority. It's not government, but it's how you call it, so in Indonesia, there is a ulama organization. It is not government, but it is the authority of the ulama. So the organization said that Ahmadis is deviant. So after that, there is always persecution against Ahmadis in several places in Indonesia, and again Syiah. In Indonesia, Syiah is around 3 million people Ahmadis is just 400,000. And when one of the evidence how the hatred it's so very instilled in people is when just recently there is a scholar, the name is Jalaluddin Rahmat, passed away, and then several people said publicly, thank God, finally he died. Even though he is a very big name. Jalaluddin Rahmat is a very good scholar. He has a very great reputation, not only in Indonesia but in the region. But still, the hatred, the prejudice, and the stereotype is put against people like Jalaluddin Rahmat. And when we talk about the government involvement in several regions like West Java, several cities like Bogor, the head of the region said that the celebration of Ashura cannot be held in the region. So I don't know for this thing, maybe Singapore better because Singapore government doesn't care about whether you are Shia or you are Sunni or you are Ahmadis. You can celebrate your holiday. You can do your ritual as long as you don't you don't disturb each other. But in Indonesia, the government always take position in the name of protection. So they always say that for the security, so to avoid social conflict, we cannot allow you to celebrate Ashura. That happened. And actually, for myself, I was born out and I grew up in East Java, majority Muslim, but just regular Muslim. I said regular Muslim because we do practice Islam, but we just regular Muslim. So for my family, for myself, I never think that we are Sunni and those Shia. No, we just Muslim. That's my knowledge, my consciousness since the beginning. Just recently I learned about Shia. Just recently I learned about Sunni. But I agree with what Imran said when we're talking about anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish. I grew up with that kind of prejudice. So I grew up with the awareness, the consciousness, imagination that Jewish is what is not good, is not our friend, and it just passed from generation to generation. In fact, I just found my first Jewish friend just recently when I was in the not yet. You are my so not my first. So when I was in the US, that was the time I made friend with the Jewish. So we really hate what we don't know, because I don't have Jewish friend. I hate them. So I just following the imagination that my parents, my family passed to me, and I don't know what the real thing about Jewish. That's the same situation when I talk about gay. So the two things I grew up with hating is again Jewish and gay. So later on, when I wrote a novel about transgender, about people with different sexuality orientation, it just new consciousness. It just because I believe that people's consciousness is not static, that's dynamic. So I found out that I realized that we have to embrace them. That they are part of our reality, but of our society. And difference is, we need the differences. It's not just we should accept or we should tolerance, but we need them. It's a new consciousness. So that kind of consciousness, it need to be shaped. It need to be educated. And one of the key, I think, exposure, education, and yes, we can live together Jewish, with Muslim, because if we don't know each other, we will keep hating each other. Yes.
We have one question. Any more questions?
Test.
Oh, okay, yes.
Testing. Is this working? Okay, hi. Thank you for the discussion. Very fascinating. I can't wait to dive into this book, Religious Hatred. My question has to do with the towards global context within your subtitle, global context, and vis-a-vis Abrahamic theologies, specifically on the question of millenarianism or apocalyptic thought, or in the Christian term, chiliasm, right? So it can be argued that we are living in an age of extremes where there's a lot of economic inequality, political dysfunction, social strife, and especially ecological catastrophe, right? And what I observe is that some of my circle of friends are now being attracted or lured to apocalyptic or millenarian thought because they feel that the end of days is upon us, right? And so one particular historian described religion as coming in within the spectrum of archaism, from the word archaic, meaning an idealization of the past, and the other spectrum being futurism. That means the religion idolizes the future. So it seems to me that there is a movement towards the archaic spectrum. So any comments vis-a-vis the age of extremes and millenarianist thought? And my second question is, I didn't get to read the book as mentioned, but I was attracted to page 18 where you quoted one thinker called Boaventura de Sousa Santos. The quote is, all cultures are relative, but cultural relativism as a philosophical posture is wrong. And then it went on to say that all cultures aspire to ultimate concerns and values, but cultural universalism as a philosophical posture is also wrong. So can you explain that quote to enlighten us vis-a-vis prejudice and hate? Thank you.
Sorry, before Dr. Hedges take those two questions, do you have any other questions from the floor? Okay, yes, maybe we can combine those questions and address them.
Hi, my question is slightly related to what he said. I'd like to ask the panelists for their thoughts about, like what he said, some Christians are very into end times prophecy. And I think this kind of thinking from their interpretation of the book of Revelations in the Bible has a big part to play in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and breeds a lot of prejudice, hatred, and discrimination worldwide. And so my question is, in a Singapore context, or maybe Professor Yaacob can answer, there seems to be a greater intervention when there is extremist talk among Muslim leaders, for example. But my question is, why doesn't the government intervene when there are churches who breed this kind of discrimination through end times teaching? Yeah. And for Paul Hedges, I'd like to know what do you think about how the politic dynamics of voters' religious background affect and play into how religious hatred is kept alive? How does the political dynamics of voters' religious background play into how religious hatred is kept alive worldwide? Yeah.
So, Prof. Hedges first? Okay, Professor Yaacob first.
I thought I'd go last because my question is about end of time. Your question is why the government or community leaders don't intervene when there are people who peddle such ideas, but when it comes to extreme ideas, they do. Don't know quite the answer because fundamentally, I suppose there are beliefs within Islam, for example, that there will be end of time, right? From the government perspective, as I think was mentioned by Oki, really we tend to look at only from a security point of view, basically, whether it does harm at the national level. Internally, I agree with you that I think there is a need. I go back to my earlier point about how we have to relook at our Islamic education curriculum entirely. If we believe in the end of time, which is basically, something that a lot of Muslims believe, and I think other faiths also believe, it's a question of what do you do with that belief, right? I don't specifically prepare for it. Basically, I continue to live my life the way I think I should be living my life. But if that particular idea transform a group or a subgroup to become more prejudicial or bigoted and adopt certain methods or means which bring harm to society, then I think there is a need. But certainly, I think I agree with you that there is a need for our not just religious leaders, but our educational institutions to relook at some of this content in a way that I think help, for me personally, young Muslims to make sense of the world. If we tie the narrative that the world is going to end any time and we must prepare, either build a bunker or build I don't know what, I think it will not be very healthy, frankly speaking, right? But we cannot ignore that particular belief because it does exist. It's a question of how we use that belief and embrace that belief in a way that actually should bring more good than harm, in the sense of if the world is going to end, let us make sure that the world is a good world before it ends, rather than the world is really going to be crumbling to pieces and what have you. So my message to all Muslims, young and old, is that we must continue to do good. We must continue to make sure that we leave a place which is much better than what we found it to be, because that is our role as Muslims, as members of a particular faith, and this is not just confined to Islam, but Christianity, Judaism, and other faith, that we are supposed to do good. We are supposed to be constructive members of society, so that at the end of the day, we leave something which is much more pleasant than what we found it to be. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll answer sort of, to some extent, both questions together as there's linkages on here. Yeah, I mean, if you believe the end of times have come in, then yes, I mean, you're going to be more psychologically fraught, you're going to be more psychologically stressed, and therefore prejudice is going to sort of come to you more naturally, sort of in-group, out-group formations, a sense of danger, all of that is present in your mind. Now, I think as Jakob has just been saying, sort of what that means to you and how that plays out can vary a lot. You can see this as a time of sort of danger and warfare. You can see it, if you like, as a time of, of coming of great peace. And certainly within Christianity, if you like, you can find both of these narratives there as part of it. Again, if you go back to the past or if you go back to the future, you can read it in different ways. And again, you sort of picked up, if you like, sort of the Book of Revelations in this. Now, I think it's fair to say that nobody understands the Book of Revelations. I mean, that's part of the point of it. The best analysis I have ever seen suggests it can only be understood if you understand Babylonian astrology. Now, that may seem an odd thing. Most Christians think that Christians are against astrology. Basically, back in the ancient world, everybody believed in astrology. If God had created the whole world, he'd set all those stars in place. You could see God's order in all sorts of stuff. And astrology was there. So if you walk in the medieval cathedrals, you will find, if you like, sort of the horoscopes sort of there on the floors of these cathedrals. All of this was sort of tied up together. So, yeah, I mean, nobody understands this book, but I said it doesn't stop people from attempting to understand it and reading all sorts of stuff into it. This then comes to the question of what are extreme views? Now, going back, I said I've mentioned already that Christians bear the responsibility for what has happened in anti-Semitism over the last 2,000 years. This includes basically the New Testament text itself. The New Testament was written by Jews who understood themselves as being part of the Jewish tradition. Jesus was Jewish, all of his disciples were Jewish. But basically, as they were starting to write this down, it was coming, if like, an increasing time of tension, if you like, between what was seen, if like, as the mainstream Jews who remained loyal, if you like, to the synagogue and sort of the rabbis, and those Jews were starting to understand Jesus as the Messiah. And so in that book, there were sort of lots of mentions of the Jews. So again, back to this sort of time, sort of Peter and disciples, they barricaded themselves in the room for fear of the Jews. So if I can put this quite bluntly, reading the biblical text itself can lead people into anti-Semitism. If you read it in a very straightforward way, there's stuff that seems to suggest Christians and Jews are polarized each other. And very early on, the Christian tradition started to read this. What became, if you like, sort of the early church fathers, they had a whole set of literature, Adversus Judaeus, against the Jews. Basically, the whole of early Christian doctrine and teaching is embedded in anti-Semitism, unfortunately. So, to some extent, again, it goes back to your thing, your young friends, the Jews killed Jesus. I mean, yeah, you read the New Testament, it will tell you that. And this comes back, again, to our questions around education. As, if you like, sort of, the pastors, the priests in the churches, when they're going through these texts, and these debates taking place in many places of the world, do we read the whole text? Because there are parts of it that don't look very nice. Do we edit the text? Do we give the whole text, but then, if you like, give an explanation behind it? And I said, if you understand it in the context of the times, then actually the New Testament itself is not an anti-Semitic text. But the way it is so easily read, particularly by Christians today, 2,000 years later, anti-Semitism, if you like, is naturally going to come into your minds within this. So this question, like, when do you limit sort of anti-Semitism? I mean, to some extent, basically you could walk into a church today and arrest everybody for preaching anti-Semitism, because in a sense it does look like that in certain ways. So, yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of sort of dangers, I said, of understanding this. So again, yes, sort of these past times, these future times. And again, with Christians, you want to go back to the past. Well, yes, if you go back to the past, then you understand Jesus as Jewish and his disciples as Jewish, and this is part of a Jewish tradition. So, I mean, there are positive aspects there. But it also leads into some other problems as well. Increasingly these days, Christians are doing what they call sort of Seder sort of meals around this sort of time of year, but of course the Jews representing Passover sort of have a Seder meal. And the idea is that they're getting back to Jesus and his disciples and the Last Supper. However, Seder meals did not exist in first century Judaism. Whatever Jesus and his disciples were doing was not a Seder meal. This is something like developed sort of afterwards, like the rabbis, as they were trying to make sense, if you like, tradition without the temple anymore, they had to sort of innovate to some extent sort of new traditions, and a Seder meal was part of this. This is how you work without the temple in place. So, yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of problems. So when people look back to the past, yes, it can have positive outcomes, it can have negative outcomes. When we look to the future, it can have positive outcomes, it can have negative outcomes. And you also asked about the global political scenario. Yes, I mean, absolutely, this plays into it. Generally, while, if you like, in theory, genocide could happen anytime, genocide, to the best of my knowledge, have never happened without a fraught political situation. People are in terms of existential sort of crisis, there are financial worries, there are sort of social worries. I said, this is something, as people become more scared about themselves, the in-group, out-group sort of association become a lot tighter, a lot worse. So yes, this plays into it as well as I said, how this is shaped through these like sort of end-time sort of narratives as well. And again, if I can go back perhaps to Basil's sort of question earlier, he mentioned, well, we weren't religious hatred, what about everything else as well? Yes, sort of, the global sort of ecological sort of disaster. We're seeing like increasing polarization of some people, against those people they see as causing ecological sort of disaster. And we become sort of more polarized in our societies in various ways. So, yeah, we need sort of narratives, again, back to narratives. Narratives are incredibly important. We need to tell better stories about who we are and how we fit into our relationships with everybody else. I mean, to some extent, overcoming prejudice, it's not hard. We just tell better stories. It's kind of all we need to do. But that itself is incredibly hard, to tell good stories within this. Okay, back to your question, which is an entirely separate thing about the DeSantos quote. That was put in there about a particular kind of sort of argument amongst scholars. And if you like, there are debates, particularly if like in a post-colonial sort of decolonial sort of thing, where we know an awful lot of stuff, if you like, has been constructed like through Western sets of theory, which is trying to explain the whole world. And I've said like prejudice theory applies to everybody. This is basically lots of theory created by white Western men predominantly. However, I think it's one of those theories, unlike all sorts of other stuff, that actually does work fairly globally across populations. the way we as human beings work, in fact, there's a whole evolutionary background. You know, if we look at us coming out of, you know, sort of chimps, bonobos, other sort of primates, some of what we do is actually quite like what they do. So I think, you know, when you're looking at sort of examples like that, you can somewhat generalize across the human species and not see this as sort of more, this is a particularly sort of, you know, a Western thing that doesn't work elsewhere. Again, if we've been talking about religious hatred, religion is a terrible word. I don't have time to go into it now, but there's a whole Western sort of category of creation sort of there, which we could go into another time. So I said that's really what that quote is about. Sort of, you know, that yes, we shouldn't sort of get stuck in cultural relativism where we say everything is different, and we shouldn't get stuck, you know, in a cultural sort of universalism. We always need to be aware that, like what we're saying, there's always a background as to where we're coming from and where it comes out of. And again, this applies to our stories. And perhaps, again, actually, we don't need to tell better stories. But, you know, the story you need to tell in Singapore is probably different from the story in Indonesia. It's different from the story in the UK. It's different from the story in the USA. And they've got lots of stories they need to tell there at the moment. So, yeah, I hope that sort of answers all those questions.
I think if we have no more questions from the floor, we also have no more questions online. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Prof. Hedges, Professor Yaacob, Ben, and Oki for today. A little sales pitch. You can get Prof. Hedges' book at Wardah, if I'm not mistaken, Wardah, right? Wardah Bookstore. And also thank you to Sifu for organizing this